Guys, today at Summing Up Films, I'm going to explain about a sci-fi thriller called Omen, where a mysterious letter is buried in a time capsule for 50 years, and this letter has the exact date of every catastrophe that occurred during all of those years. MIT astrophysics professor John finds the document and tries to prevent the tragedies to come. Be aware that from now on there will be spoilers. The year is 1959. Lucinda is in her schoolyard. But unlike the other students, she looks pretty distraught, isolated in a corner. The class teacher, Miss Taylor, calls the kids back to the classroom. But Lucinda doesn't even hear the teacher's call. When the class arrives back in the room, Miss Taylor tells the class to draw what they think the future would be like, and then all the drawings would be stored in the capsule to be opened 50 years into the future. After some time, Miss Taylor went to get the students' drawings, but when she got to Lucinda's desk, she noticed that the girl only scribbled numbers on the entire sheet. Lucinda apparently heard whispers in her head saying a sequence of numbers, and in turn she frantically wrote them down on her sheet of paper. The teacher then takes her supposed drawing before finishing and collects the rest. Later that day, the school principal announces that the time capsule with the students' works will open in 50 years. Soon after, it is buried in a hole at the entrance to the school. At this point, Miss Taylor looks back and sees Lucinda. But the second time she turns around, the girl is gone. They looked for her late into the night, and Miss Taylor went to find the girl in a closet. Her fingers were all bloody, with some broken nails, because the girl was scratching at the door apparently for no reason. Lucinda then tells the teacher to stop the voices in her head from whispering, for God's sakes. 50 years later, John is looking through a telescope and tells his son, Caleb, to come and take a look at Saturn's rings. The boy asks him if anyone has found life on other planets, but John says it's just us for now. However, when Caleb asks how many planets can potentially host life, John explains the Goldilocks zone idea. But the boy already knows it. Caleb then goes to his room to watch TV, and John arrives later to tell him to go to bed because he has class the next day. Caleb reminds him that it's the 50th anniversary of school and that he won't be in school. Before leaving, John puts Caleb to bed and tells him he loves him. The boy then takes off his hearing aid and puts it on the nightstand. Later, John drinks watching a mysterious gift on top of a closet until he falls asleep, as he thinks of his wife who passed away the year before. John works at MIT as a professor of astrophysics. The lecture he gives reflects the main philosophical problem of the film, the theme of random aspect versus determinism in the universe. He returns to the idea of the Goldilocks zone with his students, which basically consists of a hypothetical exoplanet being located in the habitable zone of a star, just like the Earth. Following this analogy, a golden curls planet would be one that would not find itself too close or too far from its star, that is, in the perfect place for life, privileged by others. The professor explains both sides of the argument, one side being order and purpose, and the other side, coincidence. Infer it. When pressed by students about their position on the subject, John says he believes things just happen. His friend, a cosmologist, Phil, walks in the schoolyard with John talking about some date he'd like to arrange for John. Talking about dates. John remembers his son's school ceremony and arrives, a little late, but still catches Caleb singing in the school choir. When the time capsule is finally opened, the teacher divides the envelopes among the children. She randomly hands Lucinda's envelope to Caleb, and the boy steps away from the melee to open it. The moment he opens it and sees that jumble of numbers, he notices a mysterious figure looking at him, along with that same whisper Lucinda heard when writing the letter. That same day, John is washing dishes when the boy asks if he can go to a sleepover at a friend's house that weekend, and John says he's going to think about it. He realizes that the boy has taken Lucinda's work and tells him to return it the next day. After his son sleeps watching a video of his mother still alive, John goes back to the kitchen and takes a look at the mysterious letter filled with numbers. So he randomly writes a sequence of numbers on a whiteboard, because it looks familiar to him. John then looks at the sequence of numbers and finds a date, the 11th of September 2001, and a second number after it, 2996. So intrigued, he searches the internet for the tragedy of 9/11 and sees that there were exactly 2,996 victims. John copies the numbers to a whiteboard and starts checking other possible dates. He discovers a pattern of dates and victims that represent catastrophes that occurred in the last 50 years. John, frightened by what he discovered the night before, tells his friend Phil about his theory and Lucinda's sequence of numbers. Phil asks John about the unmarked numbers that were left over in the letter and at first John couldn't explain, but in the letter there was a date for the next day, saying that 81 people would die if John's theory was right. Phil agrees, which is frightening. Yet he tells his friend that there are many other uncircled and unmarked numbers that make no sense in the sequence. John eventually gets mad/upset with Phil after he says that John was just looking for meaning in his wife's death. John, in turn, not satisfied, went after Miss Taylor. She talks about Lucinda of the day the capsule was buried and how she found it scratching the door after it disappeared. John asks if she can tell him where he can find Lucinda, but she says Lucinda unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Back at his house, John is trying to figure out the details surrounding the mysterious envelope when Caleb receives a strange visitor while playing soccer in front of his house. The mysterious figure appears in a car and gives the boy a black stone. John sees it through the window and runs off to try to talk to the mysterious figure, but the car drives away. John's sister shows up to visit the two. She's worried about them and offers to babysit Caleb if John wants to go out someday and clear his head. John knows that she was sent there by her parents, with whom he has a difficult relationship, especially his father, who is a pastor. After some arguments, John sends his sister away. That same night, he falls asleep drinking and watching the news, hoping to hear any news about a possible accident that had the exact 81 victims. John is then woken up by the phone ringing with Caleb asking why he wasn't at school to pick him up. So he tells Caleb that he will be there in 10 minutes, but he gets stuck in traffic on his way to school. Looking for alternative routes to get to school faster and out of the traffic jam on his GPS, John realizes that the unidentified numbers on Lucinda's mysterious letter could be coordinated. Its location seems to match the numbers described on the letter. John then gets out of the car to see what's getting in the way of traffic and actually runs into an accident, but he discovers that there were no victims on the road. An officer tells him to get back in his car, when at the exact moment a plane appears falling from the sky beside the road. John then runs on the highway towards the still burning plane wreckage, not worrying about his own safety, trying to help the possible survivors of the tragedy. He helps a boy who had his body on fire when another part of the plane explodes, then helps a woman who screams and flees in panic. John can't save a burning man, but pulls another one from the plane's wreckage when paramedics arrive and drive him away. After the bizarre incident, he returns home with his sister listening to the news on TV about the accident that took 81 lives. So she asks Caleb to go upstairs to her room so she can talk to John, but he just goes to sleep without saying anything. Caleb is worried about him and asks what's going on, knowing that something bad has happened, but John doesn't know what to say to his son, as he has just experienced something extremely shocking. Later, Phil arrives to check on him, and they talk again about the damn numbers in the letter. John then doesn't think it was a fluke that he was there at the time, and Phil starts to believe the numbers can mean something, but he's not entirely convinced. There are two more numbers in the sequence that John thinks represent future accidents, as a sort of warning addressed to him, and soon he would have to do something about it. When Phil leaves, the mysterious figure who gave Caleb a pebble appears near his house again, but this time he walks into Caleb's room and shows him that something absolutely terrible is going to happen in the future, a world completely on fire. Caleb is then startled by what he sees through the window and starts screaming. John runs towards him, and when he finds his son, he finds him on the floor crying, thinking he had a nightmare, but he sees the figure outside and runs after him, enraged, telling him to stay well away from the house and the son. The next morning, John finds Lucinda's house and sees her daughter and granddaughter leaving the house. He then follows the two to a natural history museum. Arriving there, he asks Caleb to befriend his granddaughter, Abby. The two talked for a while, until John decided to open the game and tell Diana why he wanted to talk to her. John asks Diana if her mother had any kind of ability or gift, explaining that her son attended the same school as Lucinda and talked about the letter Caleb had received in the time capsule. He thinks there are people like Diana's mother who can see things happening before they actually happen. Famous Mother Dinah. Diana then gets angry and calls Abby to leave. John tells her about the plane crash, the date and place that was predicted in that letter with numbers. John wants to somehow prevent what supposedly will happen on the day next, October 19th. But he wants her help. Diana doesn't accept it and thinks John is crazy and leaves with Abby. John, rather insistent not to say annoying, follows her again and almost begs her help because he thinks it all has something to do with Caleb, afraid something will happen to him. Finally, Diana says she can't help. That same night, John reading the instructions for the weapon he bought, there was a story about a possible terrorist plot to bomb one of the major cities in the US. Meanwhile, A group of mysterious figures look at the house in the forest. John then finds the location from the numbers on the letter and goes to a payphone to inform the FBI where the alleged terrorist attack will take place the next day. The next morning, John leaves Caleb at his sister's house and says goodbye to his son. His sister hugs him, aware that he isn't telling her everything, and John tells her not to let Caleb watch the news. Then he goes to New York to see if the FBI has done anything about what he told them. John sees a police officer and asks about it. But suddenly the officers chase him, thinking he is one of the potential criminals. He flees to the crowded subway and spots a man who looks suspicious. But when John surrounds the suspect, the man turns around, already surrendering. Stolen DVDs fall out of his coat, and he says he won't do it again and gives them all back, i.e., he wasn't a terrorist, just a half-assed thief. Suddenly another train in the same direction as the subway line leaves the tracks and heads towards John's train. He sees it through the window and yells for people to retreat to the cars behind. The runaway train wreaks havoc on the entire subway, breaking pillars, knocking everything down. John emerges from the chaos bewildered and worried that he has failed to save people or prevent tragedy from happening. John arrives home and finds Diana waiting for them with Abby. Caleb then takes Abby into the house, and Diana immediately tells John what her mother, Lucinda, told her about October 19th. She says that Lucinda talked about this encounter all the time because she was convinced that it was the day Diana was going to die. In the next scene, we see the four of them inside the car going to Lucinda's house. The children are sleeping in the back seat of the car, and Diana then tells openly that she doesn't want to believe that anyone can predict the future. Besides, she doesn't want to know what her future holds. John tells her about the fire that killed his wife, and when he saw the date on the page, he immediately thought that if he had found the letter sooner, he would have been able to save her and change what happened. His reason for trying to stop the tragedies from happening is to wonder if he would have been able to help them. Picking up the page with the numbers made him question whether things happen in a predetermined way, as opposed to how he'd thought all his life before. They arrive at the isolated house where Lucinda used to live, and leave the children safely in the car while they enter the house to find something that could help them through this madness. Before entering, Diana reads the final script on the page and says it's not 33, but an EE written backwards. Inside the house, Diana tells John that all her life she believed her mother was sick, and that she moved into the forest to prepare for something. They enter Lucinda's office and find newspaper clippings from tragedies around the world taped to every wall in the room, and a drawing of the Bible that Diana rips off the wall and takes with them. Then they go to her room, where John finds another one of the black stones. Meanwhile, in the car, Caleb wakes up and sees the mysterious figures approaching in the glass. John finds more of these stones under her bed. As he lifts the bed, John finds the phrase, "everyone," scrawled across the underside of the bed. He realizes that EE represents this, everyone else. The mysterious figures are almost in the car, so Caleb honks his horn to get John and Diana's attention. When the two reach the car, Caleb tells his father about the figures. Abby says the figures said they could go with them if they wanted. John sees one of the figures in the middle of the forest, and then chases him through the forest, but when he finds him, he has a not very pleasant experience. They return to John's house, and he and Diana think the figures have been following them for days. John tells her that Lucinda can see the end of it all, but she still doesn't believe it. The next morning, John approaches Abby, who is painting a picture of her grandmother's house, and when he sees her, he has an idea that he needs to check out the observatory. When they get there, Phil follows them to his lab where John searches for his research on solar flares. John thinks the numbers are a warning to everyone about a solar storm that could wipe out all life on the planet. He thinks that government institutions already know what will happen, and the announcement will be made soon. John wonders how he is supposed to prevent the end of the world, and tells Phil to go home with his wife. He goes after Diana, who believes that if they hid underground, they might have a chance. So she suggests some caves where she used to play as a child. John agrees, and in the next scene, they are back at home gathering as many supplies as they can to take to the cave. He then finally decides to open the mysterious gift his wife had given him before her death and finds a locket with a picture of them inside. He then calls his father to say goodbye and tell him about the coming apocalypse. His father tells him that if God thinks it's his time, then he will go and not try to run away from the apocalypse. When they hang up, John goes to get Caleb and finds him writing numbers. When he takes out the paper, the boy is still writing on the table. And when he takes out his pen, Caleb is still writing with his nails, just like Lucinda did 50 years ago. Suddenly, John has the idea of looking for the door that Miss Taylor spoke to him when he was at his house. He breaks into the school and finds the door Lucinda was writing with her nails and leads the door to her house. Desperate Diana tells him they need to go to the caves. John refuses to go until he gets the paint off the door. John thinks the numbers Lucinda scratched might be on the door and tell them a place they could go to save themselves. Meanwhile, Diana picks up the kids and leaves with them, telling Caleb that his father was already following right behind them. John finally finds the place, and when he leaves to break the news, he realizes they are gone, so John gets in his car and immediately goes after them. In the car, Abby tells her mother that the figure's nowhere to go because she heard a whisper in her head. Diana then freaks out. She stops at a gas station, and while listening to the news broadcast at the convenience, Caleb calls John from a payphone. Diana finds him on the phone and tells John where they're going, apologizing for taking Caleb with her. He tells her that the numbers are the location of her mother's house and that they need to get there as soon as possible. But Diana disagrees. Suddenly, Diana sees a black stone on top of the phone she was using, and when she turns around, she sees the figures fleeing with her car, taking the children. She steals a car at the gas station and immediately goes after them. Unfortunately, during her pursuit, Diana is run over by a truck. John finally finds her in an ambulance on the road, and she dies when the clock strikes exactly midnight. He says goodbye to her and goes to her mother's house, hoping to find the children there. John sees the tire tracks and heads through the woods to Diana's abandoned car, and then he gets out of the car and finds Caleb. John says they have to go, but his son says they need to go with the pictures. Abby also appears, telling John they won't hurt them. The children tell him that the pictures protect them at all times, and that the message they sent was a kind of preparation. Caleb and Abby are among those chosen to be saved by the aliens. Suddenly, a huge alien spacecraft appears in the sky, shocking John. Caleb thinks the three can go to the ship, but the alien makes it clear they are just kids. John realizes that if he wants his son to be safe, he must let Caleb go with the aliens. So he says goodbye to his son and hands him the medallion that once belonged to his mother. They hug. Then the boy goes with the aliens, who transform into their original forms and lead the children to the ship. The spacecraft leaves the planet, while John looks on in wonder and sadness at the same time. More than one ship can be seen leaving Earth and taking the chosen to some unknown corner of the universe. The next day, John returns to his parents' house to wait for the family apocalypse, as he cannot leave with the aliens. The supersolar storm rips through the planet, destroying any traces of life that once existed there. In the final image of the film, children can be seen in another world, running towards a beautiful tree. If you had found a letter with the date of all the disasters that would happen in the future, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel by activating the bell to receive notification of upcoming videos here on Summarizing Movies. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.